Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a little housekeeping. Feel free to ask us questions at any time, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. And as well, this webinar is off the record, but it will be recorded and archived online. So if you missed something and you want to go back and watch it, or you want to share it with friends, you'll definitely be able to do that. So today's webinar is 5 Things to Watch in 2018. So we're just going to kind of give you a rundown of some things I would say to keep in mind as the year goes through, especially in terms of these will kind of be dynamics that will be in play throughout the year and could have an impact on important science policy issues. I'd like to start out today by introducing our presenters. My name is Brittany Webster, and I'm a senior specialist here at AGU.
Hi, my name is Tamia Chris, and I'm the Public Affairs Analyst here at AGU.
I'm Carissa Bungie. I am a Senior Specialist at AGU.
And so to give you a rundown for today, we're going to talk about the budget deal and appropriations. And it'll be a very interesting discussion talking about fiscal year 2018 and simultaneously fiscal year 19 as well. And then I'm going to give you a little bit about the Senate and kind of how new members have changed the dynamics of the Senate in a way that will be very exciting to see this year. And I'll also be talking about how the 2018 midterm elections are going to play a really big role, I think, in this year, including in terms of what the legislative agenda is. And then I'll turn it over to Carissa to talk about nominations and where they stand. And she'll also talk about legislation, science policy legislation that's kind of in play right now, but also on the horizon. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tamia.
Thanks, Brittany. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget deal and the appropriations landscape. As Brittany mentioned, it's a little bit of a complex situation that we're dealing with this year, so I will try to go through all of the things, but feel free to ask some questions and we can follow up at the end if anything wasn't clear. So first, I want to kind of go with some background on what the appropriations process should look like, what appropriations means, just so that we're all on the same page. So this might be familiar to some, it might just be a refresher, or it might be new to others. So first, there's two different types of major different types of legislation. There's authorization bills that basically give the government legal authority to spend money. It establishes programs, makes mandates. Appropriations, on the other hand, are about spending, where the money is going, and these are the only must-pass bills every year. Just so you know, fiscal years start on October 1st each year. So for example, October 1st of this year will be the beginning of fiscal year 2019. So it's a little offset from the calendar year. So that means that something needs to happen in this spending realm before October 1st, or we will experience a shutdown. So I also just wanted to go over the general process for how the budget appropriations should work. This is not to say this is how it's worked this year, but just to give you a sense of what is expected and in what order. That way you can better understand how we've kind of veered off track a little bit. So basically what happens in early February, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, will submit the president's annual budget. This is a big budget release from the president. It is usually crafted with the input from federal agencies, but the president's budget is not law. It's really just an outline of the president and the administration's priorities. By April, the Senate and House budget committees need to draft a budget resolution. Basically, they need to say how much money is there available to spend in different categories of funding, being defense and non-defense discretionary spending. This is basically like when you make a budget for your own house. How much money do you have available, and how should that be allocated into buckets like grocery shopping versus travel? Next, within those budget limits, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees will start to divvy up the funding by program. So they'll start drafting their appropriations bills. There's 12 of them. And start talking about where this money should go within those limits that the budget committee set. Appropriations committees will then consider the bills, similar to what you would expect in other legislation, where they'll have, a subcommittee hearing, where they'll vote on the bill at the subcommittee level. The full committee will vote on the bill, and then eventually, if it's passed, it will go to the chamber floor, where it needs to be voted on. Just like any other legislation, the House and the Senate need to pass the same version of the bill before it can go to the president for signature. So in some ways, it's very similar to legislation, but there's some added things at the beginning that kind of get the ball rolling. So let's talk about where we are right now. So right now, we are in fiscal year 2018. We are under a continuing resolution, meaning that Congress kept the same spending levels as FY17, and it's a short-term spending bill. Right now, the current continuing resolution that we have runs through March 23rd, and it's actually our 5th CR this fiscal year. So we've been pushing the deadline back to give the appropriator time to figure out how they're going to spend the money. So while the House, if you see in this figure, has passed all its appropriations bills, the Senate hasn't. The Senate does have some draft bills out there that talk about how they want money to be spent. It is different from the House. So in the end, they will need to negotiate a final deal that is the same for both the House and the Senate. There are a few things that have complicated the negotiations this year, which you may have been reading about in the news. First, there's been a number of bargaining chips. So attached to this conversation about the appropriations process has also been the conversation about DACA and disaster funding. So those have been used as areas in which Democrats and Republicans want to see some kind of action, and they have to decide what they're going to do on that in order to get enough votes for someone to vote for Appropriations Committee. So it's been this big negotiation that has included things outside of what you would consider the typical appropriation process that we're used to dealing with. The other thing that's kind of complicated the situation is the discussion about a budget agreement. So Sequestration was slated to be enacted this year, and so as you know, that means cross-the-board cuts. So there was a push to do a budget deal that would raise the caps and the amount of money available to spend to kind of prevent these across-the-board cuts. One great thing about that is that happened last week. There was a budget deal. So what does that mean? What is the budget deal? The budget deal basically determined, it was kind of a larger package first. So it included a lot of things that probably usually wouldn't be a part of a straight budget deal. But the first thing that it did is it dealt with this issue of parity. So one of the issues that came up this year was the fact that there were some people who wanted to increase the defense spending without increasing non-defense discretionary spending. Non-defense discretionary spending, you may remember, is where our federal science agencies lie. So in that sense, that would be not having parity. What a lot of Democrats wanted and some other folks wanted was an issue where the defense and non-defense discretionary spending caps were raised simultaneously and sequestration was averted. It turns out that that is what happened. We increased both the defense and non-defense discretionary, not by the same amount, but they were both increased under this budget deal. In addition to that, we also had the CR was attached to it, which gave appropriators more time to figure out what the spending bills would look like for FY 2018. They also attached some emergency funding for Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas. They also raised the debt ceiling, so they pushed that back to March 2019, which was something that will come back around, a conversation that will happen again. And then also they allocated some funding for the infrastructure bill that President Trump has been very on board with. One thing that I want you guys to notice is that when you see the breakdown of the votes, it definitely was bipartisan. That is pretty typical for these spending bills. We need people from both the Democratic side and the Republican side to come together to come to agreement. For example, fiscal conservatives, so some of our Conservative Freedom Caucus folks, they really are concerned about the deficit. And anything that's going to increase the deficit is usually something that they're not supportive of. They want to make sure that we are handling our deficit in a responsible way. So if there's something that is going to increase funding or spending or the deficit, likely Republicans will then have to reach over to the other side in order to further their agenda. So just something to know as we move forward. Okay, so that is FY18, but at the same time, we have now started budget and appropriation process for fiscal year 2019, which starts October 1st of this year. This process is basically started with the release of the White House's budget, so the president's budget request. I just wanted to have a couple reminders here. The president's budget request is not law. Again, it's just his priorities. Congress is the one who has the power of the purse. They're the ones who decide what the spending levels are, but it does give an indication of where the president's priorities lie. The current request actually includes an addendum. As I mentioned, the spending caps were increased. So now there's more money on the table. So that means that the president had the option, which he did, to list out priorities of what to do with the extra funding. So you will probably have seen that there was an addendum, and we've added that information into our next slide, so it's all included. And then the other thing is the president's budget is likely dead on arrival. As you'll see, there's going to be some very steep cuts for some of our federal science agencies, and with Congress having the power of the purse, they may decide to go a completely different direction than what the president has outlined in his budget. So don't get too distraught by some of the cuts I'm going to show. So this is just a graph showing some of our federal science agencies and the proposals in the president's budget compared to FY 2017 funding levels. So what you'll see is that NOAA, EPA, and USGS would experience some pretty intense cuts under this plan. It seems as though NASA and NSF and DOE are doing a lot better than those other agencies. I just want to caution by saying, even though it looks like, say, NASA, NSF, and DOE are doing better under this plan, it doesn't mean that programs under those agencies haven't been slated for elimination under that proposal. So it's kind of not the whole picture. It's just a top bird's eye view of what the funding landscape would be under that proposal. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the other provisions that were in the president's budget. This is not all of them. This is just a snapshot of some of them. So you can get a sense of why those numbers are not always indicative of what's happening at the program by program level. So first, something that did happen or is proposed under the president's budget is to combine the Joint Polar Satellite System, JPSS, with the Polar Follow-on programs into a single program. So this is an area where the president is outlining a priority or a policy change that he'd like to see under his proposal. But there was also a number of eliminations and cuts. For example, DOE seemed to fare pretty well under the president's budget. There were also things like the elimination of ARPA-E, which is a DOE program. This is also a repeat from last year, but there's been some pushback on that in Congress. Other things that were on the table as being slated for cuts or elimination were a lot of the climate-related programs, particularly in EPA, saw a lot of cuts under this plan to climate-related programs. At NASA, they saw termination of the Office of Education. And then also at USGS, there was some language about how much funding was available for the full-time employees, and it seems that the president's budget was proposing a reduction in the USGS workforce. So one thing that I also want to note is that in the addendum, one thing that was of note is that the president said that with the increase in defense spending, he would take all that money and apply it, all the available money under defense and apply it. But he did say in this letter that was written on his behalf by O&B director that it would be fiscally irresponsible to spend all of the money available in the non-defense discretionary funding. So the numbers that you see here do not account for all the money that's available on the table for Congress to spend. So kind of what do we expect moving forward? Well, number one, Congress has to finish FY 2018 appropriations process. So that's the first thing they're going to focus on before they move to FY 2019. The reason why that's of note is that they will need to finish 2018 or pass another CR to give them more time by the 23rd of March. After they finish FY 18, they need to immediately get to the FY 2019 appropriations process because that needs to be passed before October 1st. Otherwise, we will be in a shutdown situation, or they will need to pass another CR to figure out the spending process. So this has been a really crazy year with our 5 CRs and our 2 shutdowns already this fiscal year. So we are really hoping that Congress can come to an agreement that establishes stable funding for our science agencies because CRs, provide a lot of uncertainty for our agencies, make it hard for them to start new programs and new funding, but also make sure that they're funded at robust levels. So I already kind of mentioned this, that the new fiscal year will start October 1st. So in theory, they need to kind of finish all of these things before that deadline. I will also say that the president must sign the bill, and don't be surprised if you see all 12 appropriations bills combined into an omnibus. So I know we covered a lot of things, and it's a little convoluted this year with our 2 fiscal years being considered at the same time. So I just wanted to highlight some of the issues that we're keeping track of, and we hope that you're following us, are following these issues with us, and points where we're probably going to need your help to really weigh in to talk about the importance of this. So number one is prioritizing science and the extra money that's available from the budget agreement. We just want to make sure that science benefits from the extra money that's on the table, and that our lawmakers know that science is important for our nation, for our economy, public health, national security. Obviously, we want them to finish the appropriations process. Continuing resolutions are, not a good situation for our science agencies, so we want to make sure they have predictable funding through the rest of the fiscal year. We're also going to be looking at FY 2019. So whatever happens with the spending levels in 2018 are kind of going to be a preview for 2019. So we want to make sure that not only in 18, but also in 19, we're having robust funding. And eventually we're going to be looking at the riders or amendments to the appropriations bills and making sure that none of those are harmful for science. So in terms of keeping track of what's going on in this space, we definitely suggest that you sign up for science policy alerts to get up-to-date information about all of these things that might be happening, when they're happening, and what you can do about it. Check out our science policy website where we do funding updates and have a lot of tools and resources for you. Our AGU Action Alert is a place where you can take action. You can send letters directly to your member of Congress and make it very easy, click of a button. Right now we have an action up there asking members of Congress to allocate some of that extra money that's on the table to science to make sure that they're funded robustly. So please consider taking some time to do that for us. And then also, AAAS has a great federal budget website, so if you haven't seen it, check it out. And then our news folks here at EGU, EOS.org, are tracking this and will be issuing news stories as things develop.
Thanks, Tamia. So now I'm going to turn to talking about the Senate. So I'm talking about the Senate because the Democrats gained 1 seat this fall when Doug Jones was elected to the Alabama seat formerly occupied by Jeff Sessions. And because the 2 independents in the Senate, kind of designated by the yellow here, caucus with the Democrats, the Senate is now, for, let's say, all intents and purposes, 49 Democrats to 51 Republicans. So this composition of the Senate will ensure that the Congress of 2017 and kind of the Congress of 2018 are going to be very different. And so this is significant for 3 main reasons. One is this 49-51 split. It's important because for every piece of legislation the Senate considers, to limit consideration of a bill, you need 60 votes, or 3/5 of the chamber to vote in favor of limiting consideration. So if a piece of legislation does not get 60 votes, then a lone senator can talk on the floor for however long they want, and this is what's known as a filibuster. To re-jog your memory a little bit, some rather famous recent filibusters include one by Senator Murphy, who talked for 15 hours on gun control, and then also one from Senator Rand Paul, who spoke for 13 hours on kind of issues of foreign surveillance and privacy rights. And so the second reason this 49-51 split's important is because of nominees. So right now, for Senate Majority Leader McConnell to pass any of the administration's nominees, he needs all 51 Republican senators to approve the nominee. That's a fairly high bar, especially considering there are a couple of senators who've been sick and have missed a lot of votes this year, and because these are political appointees who often have an ideological viewpoint that not all senators, even within one party, agree with. So again, this 49-51 split means that any Republican senator can put a hold on a nominee. So how this works is that the nominee vote will come up on the floor, and they will ask for unanimous consent to vote on the nominee. And then a senator can object, and the objector can then debate the nominee for up to 30 hours. So this takes up precious floor time, which usually means that any nominee with a hold on it just won't be brought to the floor at all. And because the Senate split is so narrow right now, this also means that Democrats can effectively place holds on nominees as well. So one tool McConnell does have in his back pocket is that he can call in Vice President Pence to break the tie, which we saw last year with Betsy DeVos. And finally, there are factions in both parties who don't always agree with the party line or sometimes want something in return for their vote. So here's just a great example of the factions within a party and how that can affect a vote. So this is from the healthcare bill last year that was to repeal Obamacare. And you can kind of see that the conservatives on the right, this was something they really wanted to see happen. And then there were centrists, so Senators Murkowski and Collins, who both objected. They wanted kind of a softer touch to reforming healthcare. And then there was Senator Kane objecting, but more because of kind of the very partisan process that this bill was being considered under. So even in one party, and even in the controlling party, it can be really hard to pass legislation. And then when you have this narrow margin of 49-51, it makes it even tougher. So just the bottom line is expect to see a lot more bipartisanship this year. especially in the Senate, and expect the Democrats, who, despite not having the majority in any chamber, assert a lot more influence. I think you'll see a lot of times where people talk about the House can do whatever they want, but then you get to the Senate and it's kind of a different story. So even the House has to consider what will pass in the Senate and kind of vice versa. And I think a good example of the bipartisanship we've already seen this year would be the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 that was passed last week. And I just want to wrap up this section with an idea that I think it should be very relatable to earth scientists, that although the congressional process is fairly cyclical, forces are always changing. So, I think it was already pretty tight in the Senate, but I think we'll see this year that even that one additional seat will make lots of differences. And I think coming upon an election year, that will also be especially true. So now I'm going to turn to talking about the midterm elections. And this is something that's going to be on the mind of every representative and dozens of senators. And in an election year, every vote, every action, every press clip, has the possibility of becoming a negative or positive ad. And while the election will encourage some bipartisanship, it will also encourage ideological fights. So with that, I'm going to give you the lowdown on elections to watch and the general outlook for the Senate and House. But please keep in mind we have 9 months until the election, and a lot can happen in that time. So let's start with the Senate. There are 34 senators up for re-election this year. Democrats are the incumbent, so they're kind of defending 25 races, while the Republicans are incumbent in 9 states. So definitely this is going to be a tough year for Democrats and a little bit of an easier year for Republicans. And so here's a breakdown of all the senators who are either running for re-election or they're retiring and their seat is up for election. And so you can see there are lots of senators who are safe. So these are kind of designated by the solid Democrat, solid Republican. But if a senator or their seat is in the lean or toss-up category, these are probably going to be your battleground states, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about these elections. And if you live in one of these states, prepare yourself for the political ads. So as you saw, again, we talked about Democrats are in a lot more tough elections just because they're in more elections overall this year. And this is because there are about 10 Democrats who are running in states that Trump took. And there's only one Republican who's really vulnerable, who's Senator Heller from Nevada, because he's running in a state that Hillary Clinton took. Nevada is definitely just one of those states where it's just voters' populations are just changing. So this is something I think that's pretty common knowledge, but interesting to note is that the president's party often loses seats in a midterm election. People have had 2 years with the president and they don't like what he's doing, or they don't think he's changing things fast enough, and they're like a little frustrated. And likely that tends to play in the opposite party's favor. And this is generally going to be true in the House as well. You can see there are some exceptions, years where that didn't happen, but generally it's true that the president's party doesn't do as well in the midterm year. So turning out of the House, you can kind of see the same breakdown again, but more for the House. And you can see that the kind of seats in play tend to be lean Republican or toss-up or lean Democrat. And these are where things stand right now, but as we learn more about who's retiring and who kind of possible candidates are, or just as, political issues come up, all of these kind of could change. So this is kind of if Democrats, want to regain the House. This is kind of a breakdown of the seats they must win. One thing to note here, Republicans have a rule that a representative can only chair a committee for 3 Congresses, and then they are removed from that position. They can stay on the committee, but a lot of them, after you've been the chair, you might not just want to be a regular committee member. They can go on to chair another committee, but that's not guaranteed since chairmanships are awarded on a seniority likability system. You'll also notice that all the members with stars next to their names are representatives not seeking election, and this is due to the Republican chairmanship rule, but also members running for other offices such as governor or senator, as well as members' districts changing in terms of voter population. And again, as I mentioned before, being in the president's party can also just be really hard in a midterm election if you're, unless you're in a very, very safe area. And I want to highlight that there are exceptions to this rule, although they tend to be caused by major events. So looking at the chart going back to 1862, you can see all the times the party's president lost seats on the right, on the left, and on the right you'll see the exceptions. And you can see some of the exceptions are like 9/11 or President Clinton being impeached. So they tend to be pretty big reasons for the exception. And I also want to mention that gaining seats is not the same thing as gaining a majority. Unlike the Senate, which rules by kind of a 3/5, so kind of guarantees bipartisanship, the House rules by the majority. And all you need is around 218 votes or a simple majority to win. I say around because that 218 number can be in flux, just depending on what's going on with the House. And so this is the current composition of the House. And so despite the fact that you need a simple majority in the House, there are still factions within each party that are similar to the Senate. So sometimes you need votes from the other party to pass legislation. So even if Democrats do not win back the House, they could still advance some of their own priorities if they are able to narrow this gap even further. And you can see, just for you guys unfamiliar, the Tuesday group is the kind of moderate Republican group, and then the Freedom Caucus tends to be the most conservative part of the Republican Party. And the Blue Dog and New Democrat coalition tend to be moderates, and then the Progressive Caucus is obviously kind of the very left of the Democratic Party. And there are also a couple of vacancies. So again, we tend to say 218, but that number can be in flux. So why is all of this important? It's important because if you understand the stakes for members of Congress, you'll be better prepared to talk about the issues you care about, including science. So this is a breakdown of registered voters, and this is a poll from January 16th through the 21st of this year, kind of asking them what's the most important issue for congressional candidates to discuss during their upcoming campaigns. And I want to share this slide for a couple of reasons. Number one, you'll notice that climate change is on there. It's not the most important issue for 90% of the population, unfortunately, but for 1 in 10 voters, it is, and I think that's fairly significant. Two, notice that the number one issues for voters in battleground states is jobs and economy. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but I want you to keep this in mind when talking to your legislators. How can you talk about your science or your research or your work in a way that resonates with voters and therefore your legislator? So how can you talk about research, science, and your job in a way that relates to the economy? So just something to think about as you hopefully are considering going out and talking or reaching out to your legislators. And finally, if you want to know more about this stuff and you want to kind of become a political junkie, here are some great websites to follow. And they'll kind of showcase who's in a tough race or not, and also kind of update those lists, those battleground state lists. And these are the two I would recommend for quality and well-informed information. Real Clear Politics is an aggregate of a lot of sites, and then Inside Elections is just a really good breakdown of what's going on. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Brittany. I'm going to just scoot our speaker over a little bit. Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, excuse me. My name is Carissa Bungie. I am a Senior Public Affairs Specialist here at AGU. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about nominations and then some relevant geoscience legislation that's being considered right now. So before we jump in, I just want to briefly go over the nominations process. Brittany did a great job of kind of talking about how you need a majority in the Senate or you need 51 votes in the Senate in order for a nominee to be confirmed. But starting from the very beginning, once the president is elected, they really have to choose nominees that they think are not only qualified but also going to pass the Senate eventually. So they'll announce their intention to nominate someone. Then that nominee has to go through a whole lot of paperwork, file a bunch of disclosures about things like just their general biography, if they've contributed to political campaigns, what kind of business ties they have, and go through all the paperwork. Once that's done, they are considered in the Senate committee that has jurisdiction over the position. So, for example, for USGS Director, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee holds a hearing for that position. And in this picture, we have Sheldon Whitehouse on Senate Environment and Public Works questioning Kathleen Harnett-White for CEQ chair. And once the committee votes on the nominee, then they can move to the full floor. Like Brittany mentioned, there's a lot of things that can go wrong there. And then the nominee has to be voted on by everyone. So many times also committees want multiple nominees to be considered in one hearing, so that can hold things up as well. So it's a very complicated process that anyone can kind of put a block on. So just something to keep in mind. And this graph, before we jump into who the nominees are, this graph is showing us how many days from inauguration past administrations have nominated federal science leaders. So as you can see, regardless of party, most administrations have nominated quite a few key positions earlier than Trump has. And there's also a couple of interesting things to point out here. The first is that even in positions that Trump has nominated, you'll notice that many of them are still the open circles, which means they are not confirmed yet in the administration's term. And so either the process is moving slowly, like I just referenced in that previous slide, due to maybe other priorities, or nominees are contentious and they're not going to be brought to a vote if there's a risk of them not being confirmed. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that's really notable here is the position of White House OSTP Director, which is the yellow dot. And that person advises the president on key science issues. And that department was created in the mid-'70s, and pretty much every administration since then has had an OSTP director, with the exception of Trump, regardless of political affiliation. So just something to keep in mind, we don't even have a nominee, which is pretty concerning. And I also want to just give a shout out to AIP for this wonderful graphic that we are using, because I think it's just a great visualization. Okay, so let's talk about nominees. Who's been retained from the previous administration? We have two people here that are in key science positions. Trump chose to keep the Obama administration's director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, and he also retained France Cordova as NSF director, and she's in the middle of a 6-year term. So there are a couple of Obama holdovers that we have from the last administration that do have very pro-science views. And we've had quite a few folks confirmed in key positions. Here are just, a few of those key people. So kind of going left to right, up at the top, we got Scott Pruitt. He is the EPA administrator who, of course, had and continues to see a fair amount of pushback due to his views on climate change. We have Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, who is the Secretary of Energy. Ryan Zinke as the Secretary of the Interior, who was previously the at-large representative of Montana. Dan Brouillette as Deputy Energy Secretary, and he has extensive private and public sector experience. Then at the bottom, we have Tim Gallaudet as NOAA Deputy Administrator, and he also has extensive science background. He was formerly the oceanographer of the Navy. Walter Copen is the NIST Director. He is an expert in technology transfer and a PhD chemist. And then finally, we have Tim Petty as Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Water and Science. And Tim was actually a legislative aide for Senator Risch of Ohio previously to this position. He also served at DOI under President Bush and is a PhD as well. So you'll notice that sometimes nominees get pulled from previous administrations from the same political party. There are quite a few of the Bush administration folks that are being nominated for positions now. So that's who we've had confirmed so far. And as far as nominees go, we have 5 of them here for science-related positions. First, we have Mike Griffin. He's nominated to be Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. He was formerly the NASA administrator under the Bush administration, and his nomination is expected to go pretty smoothly, just because he has such a strong background in technology and government. We have Jim Bridenstine as NASA administrator, formerly the representative from Oklahoma, and he is facing a lot of pushback from Democrats just for his lack of formal scientific education and experience. But he's also facing a lot of opposition from a few Republicans. Marco Rubio and John McCain specifically are putting up a pretty big fight. So it is to be seen if he's going to have enough of those votes. Like Brittany mentioned, he needs those 51 votes. But there is no sign yet that Trump has kind of a backup plan for his position. So that's kind of a wait and see situation. We also have James Riley for USGS director. He was formerly a NASA astronaut and an exploration geologist, and he retired from NASA in 2008 and has since then had several stints in the private sector, and it looks like he will also probably see a pretty smooth confirmation process. But again, you can never really guess how these things are going to go. Then we have Barry Myers. He is nominated to be the NOAA administrator. And the Senate Commerce Committee advanced his nomination on a party line vote late last year, but there are quite a few objections to his ties to AccuWeather, and that there could be a potential conflict of interest there. So that may also be a contentious situation. No Republicans have publicly opposed his nomination, but that wait for a floor vote has become kind of unusually long. So that also remains to be seen. And then finally, Trump also nominated Neil Jacobs, who is a chief atmospheric scientist at Panasonic, to be Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction at NOAA. And he has faced pretty minimal opposition, but has also not been considered by the full Senate yet. So that's where we are on nominees. And one last thing, we actually have had a few nominees withdraw from consideration. The first on here is Sam Clovis. He was the nominee for Undersecretary of Agriculture for Research, Education, and Economics. And he withdrew due to criticism of his lack of scientific credentials, and his name surfaced somewhere in the Russia investigation, so he withdrew. The second person on here, Michael Dorson, he was nominated for EPA Assistant Administrator for Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and he withdrew after it became clear that he wasn't going to get enough of those Republican votes for confirmation, and there was pushback because of his ties to the chemical industry. And then finally, Kathleen Harnett-White, whose nomination hearing that picture of Sheldon Whitehouse was from, she withdrew from consideration to be chair of the White House CEQ, and she came over heavy criticism from quite a few senators for her views on climate change and denial that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. So there are a few contentious nominees that we're going to have to just wait and see if they may withdraw. They may not have the votes to be confirmed, and these are just a few of those examples. So really just circling back to that initial graph, we have quite a few unfilled vacancies right now, especially that OSTP director position. We don't even have a nominee. So something to really keep in mind, and something you may want to contact your legislators about. It's really important that we have people in these key roles. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about legislation that is currently being considered and policies that are being implemented. So I have a few highlights for geoscience laws that were actually passed that are currently being implemented and having hearings on their implementation. So the first one on here is the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act. That was signed into law by President Trump earlier this year, and that was actually the first major weather legislation enacted since the early 1990s. And it does a lot of things. It aims to improve NOAA research methods and prioritizes weather data, modeling, computing, and forecasts. It also has quite a few highlights, things like subseasonal forecasting. It protects the Hurricane Forecast Improvement Program, whose funding had been slashed. It develops an annual report on the state of weather models. It's a really great bill, and it's something that has been mentioned in a lot of nomination hearings for NOAA positions about how they're going to implement this. So that's something to keep an eye out for. The other one, the second one on here, is the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act, and that was a reauthorization bill of the America Competes Act, and it really sets policies governing NSF and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it really dictates how NSF should conduct peer review and manage research, and for the most part, it codifies protocol that NSF was already following. But there was a hearing just a couple weeks ago on this to mark the one-year anniversary of it being signed into law. And interestingly enough, they had to have an OSTP letter serve in place of a witness because we have no OSTP director. And Senator Maggie Hassan drew attention actually to that absence, which is pretty interesting. And she asked the president to nominate someone. The last thing on here, NSF harassment policies being enacted. So earlier this month, NSF put forth a new set of measures to combat sexual harassment by people working on the projects that it's funding. So they are going to require institutions to tell the agency when they make a finding of sexual harassment. And they also have to report placing grantees accused of harassment on administrative leave, and that the agency may also suspend a project's funding in such cases. So this isn't a law, but it's a policy that is recently implemented and should be on your mind. Okay, moving on to legislation. So this is quite a list here, and I'm kind of trying to give you a couple sentence summary of each of these bills. So starting from the top, we have the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program Reauthorization Act. That is a mouthful. It's also known as NEHRP because we love acronyms. That's introduced by Senator Feinstein, and that bill reauthorizes the Earthquake Hazards Program to improve the nation's earthquake preparedness, and it also modernizes earthquake safety programs. The second bill on here is another reauthorization act of the National Integrated Drought Information System, and that was introduced by Senator Thune. It reauthorizes that program, and it also focuses on subseasonal and seasonal forecasts from NOAA. Thune really likes the subseasonal and seasonal forecasts, so that's something that he also put into the weather bill. Our third bill, National Landslide Preparedness Act, that was introduced by Representative Del Bene, and it directs USGS to establish a landslide hazards reduction program, and it also puts together an interagency committee to oversee the program. And a big part of that was in response to the Oso landslide that occurred in her district. Our next bill is the National Volcano Early Warning and Monitoring System Act, and that bill was introduced by Senator Murkowski. It directs USGS to establish this program that can monitor and issue warnings to keep Americans safe from volcanoes because there are tons of volcanoes in Alaska, and something that she cares deeply about. The PREPARE Act of 2017 is introduced by Representative Cartwright from Pennsylvania, and I really like to call this one kind of the climate bill in disguise. It doesn't say climate in it, and it's a very bipartisan bill, but it focuses on community resilience to things like extreme weather, and really focusing on how we're going to deal with the effects of climate change without saying climate change. That's another really interesting and widely bipartisan bill. And the last kind of natural hazards related bill we have is the Space Weather Research and Forecasting Act that was introduced by Senator Peters and Perlmutter in the House. and that coordinates the implementation of government activities to make sure that we're ready for space weather events and make sure that everyone has a very clear role in that. Then moving on to scientific integrity bills, which we have seen quite a few of in this Congress. The first one is the Scientific Integrity Act. That was introduced by Senator Nelson in the Senate, obviously, and Tonko in the House. And that requires really that agencies are conducting scientific research and developing a scientific integrity policy while they do that, and that they submit that policy to Congress. And this is, again, kind of codifying things that are already happening, but because of kind of changing conversations around science, it's a big deal now on the Hill to protect science and make sure that scientists are free to share the data and their findings. The second one is Federal Funding Accountability for Sexual Harassers Act. That was introduced by Representative Jackie Spear, and that bill targets sexual harassment in federally funded STEM research. So that bill requires colleges to report any findings of sexual assault and harassment by professors to every federal agency that has awarded competitive research grants in the past 10 years. And that also requires agencies to consider that information while they're making funding decisions. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. The third scientific integrity bill we have is the Open Government Data Act. That was introduced by Senator Schatz in the Senate and Representative Kilmer in the House. And again, that's kind of codifying things that are sort of already happening, but making sure that science is protected and issuing a government-wide mandate that agencies publish all their information as open data, and it's kind of in a standardized format. And again, that's kind of codifying things that were a part of President Obama's open data policy. And then finally, we have two mapping bills on the bottom here. The first is the National Geologic Mapping Act, Reauthorization Act. That is a mouthful. And again, that's just a reauthorization bill that was introduced by Senator Murkowski for a program that's meant to expire in 2018. So they just want to make sure that that keeps going. And then the last one is the Geospatial Data Act. That was introduced by, I don't have the House number, I'm sorry. That was introduced by Representative Westerman in the House. I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, and Senator Hatch in the Senate. And that is also kind of about building a national spatial data infrastructure with standardized GIS data and making sure that there's compatibility between different federal information systems. So that's the rundown of legislation that's happening right now on the Hill. As you can see, a lot of science bills. And if you have any questions on any of these, a great place to start is congress.gov. It's a wonderful resource. You can see where they are in the process of becoming a law. And if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them.
Thanks, Carissa. So turning now to questions, it looks like we have one for our panel of experts here. Is an omnibus bill the expected FY 2019 solution, or are there 12 committee budget bills where we should focus attention?
That's a good question. To clarify, there are 12 appropriations bills every year. Regardless, they will be drafted as 12 different bills. Each subcommittee has a specific area in which they work. For example, the Appropriations Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, and Science will draft a bill for Commerce, Justice, and Science. Those bills can then be combined at the end so that on the Senate or House floor, they're only voting on one bill as a collective package. So in some sense, you should focus on the bill in which the funding most affects you. So for example, if you're really interested in speaking to your legislator about NSF funding, then you would want to talk to the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee of Appropriations, because they will be handling the funding levels for that agency, if that makes more sense.
I just want to add to what Cynthia said, that earlier is always better. It's always, so if you talk to the subcommittee, you know, there's 4 people who are there's like 8 to 10 people in the House and about the same number in the Senate who will be deciding yes or no on that. If you wait to the omnibus level, then you're kind of having to consider whether 435 people are going to agree to that in the House. So earlier is always better. And a lot of times too, when they get to the omnibus stage, a lot of times they're not adding things, they're just putting things together.
I think that was a really good question.
Yeah, so we have a couple of more minutes, and we're happy to take any other questions anyone has. But while people are maybe thinking about that, I just want to share our final slide, which is just kind of a list of resources and things and tools and things, ways for you to engage right now.
And if you have other questions or want to learn more about the budget and appropriations process, we are planning to have another webinar about that, so keep an eye out for it.
So we have another question. As someone who may not be a constituent of the legislator proposing a bill around science, what can I do to support a piece of legislation?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think you have a number of options depending on how connected you are to the topic. If you're a scientist that is affected by it, I think it's still good to provide those letters of support. Members of Congress are always looking for feedback, but also letters to show that what they're proposing is something that's going to help the American people. So even if you're not a constituent, I'm sure they would really love your letter of support. You can also think about doing it more as a coalition of folks. So maybe this bill helps your university that maybe is not in their district, but it helps other universities as well. You could talk to your government relations office to see if they're interested in signing on to a letter with some other universities to support that bill. And that also gives you the added benefit of being one of many to say that this bill is doing positive things for you and others.
And you can always ask your legislator to co-sponsor or support the bill. Okay, well, seeing no other questions, I just want to reiterate, I encourage you guys to sign up for our AGU Science Policy Alerts. They go out about once a month, and normally they just have really good opportunities, ways for you to engage, but also really good information. We try to curate it so it's kind of easy to read, but really important. And you can always find out more at sciencepolicy.aju.org, and you should definitely check out our Action Center and kind of engage in our newest action to make sure that science is well funded in FY 2018. And thank you guys all so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it, and please do not hesitate to reach out. We need to make our voice as strong as possible. Thank you.